There are people who enter life not through the door, but through wounds. The empath always feels it too late. First comes warmth, strange recognition, the illusion that finally someone sees the soul without masks. And then exhaustion, a heaviness that cannot be explained. Carl Jung once wrote that what remains unconscious controls life and is called fate. Manipulators know this instinctively. They do not seek love. They seek access to light, patience, tenderness, to someone who will endure more than others. The empath calls it connection. The soul quietly calls it danger. Manipulation rarely looks cruel in the beginning. It looks wounded, fragile, misunderstood, and the empath has a fatal habit, confusing pity with destiny. The heart whispers, "If nobody stayed for them, maybe I should." That is how the invisible trap closes. Little by little, boundaries dissolve. Silence becomes guilt. Fatigue becomes loyalty. Pain becomes proof of love. Jung believed that people are drawn toward their unresolved shadows. The empath often falls in love with someone who awakens the rescuer buried deep inside childhood wounds. Not because it is healthy, because it feels familiar. There is a terrifying moment that almost nobody talks about. The moment when the empath stops asking, "How do I feel?" Everything begins revolving around the other person's moods. Their storms become the weather of the entire relationship. One wrong word changes the atmosphere. One cold glance creates panic. The empath begins adjusting emotionally the way people adjust blankets during winter nights. Quietly, automatically, and this is how manipulation wins. Not through force, through emotional conditioning. Love starts feeling like walking through a dark house without making noise. Some manipulators never raise their voice. They raise confusion. The empath leaves conversations feeling guilty without understanding why, apologizing for reactions to wounds they never created. Reality begins bending slowly. Memory becomes uncertain. Intuition becomes questioned. This is why sensitive souls are vulnerable to psychological games. They naturally doubt themselves before doubting others. Jung warned that losing contact with intuition is losing contact with the soul itself. And manipulators know how to disconnect an empath from inner truth better than anyone. Not by controlling the mind, by exhausting the spirit. The strange thing is, the empath usually notices everything from the start. The red flags, the inconsistency, the emotional hunger in the other person's eyes. But another voice appears. Maybe they just need understanding. This is where self-betrayal begins. Not in the relationship itself, but in the moment intuition is abandoned to preserve attachment. And every time the empath ignores inner discomfort, the shadow grows stronger. Because the soul always punishes silence. Anxiety, insomnia, emotional numbness. These are not weaknesses. They are messages. The body screams what the mouth refuses to admit. Manipulators often sense empaths immediately, almost like predators sensing warmth in cold water. Not because empaths are weak, because they radiate emotional availability. They forgive quickly, understand deeply, stay longer than they should. And somewhere inside, many empaths secretly believe love must be earned through suffering. That devotion means enduring what others cannot. But suffering is not intimacy. Exhaustion is not loyalty. Saving someone is not the same as loving them. Some souls drain others simply because nobody ever taught them how to create their own light. One of the darkest manipulations is inconsistency. Warmth today, distance tomorrow, affection mixed with withdrawal. The empath becomes addicted not to love, but to emotional relief. Like someone dying of thirst waiting for tiny drops of affection. Psychology calls this intermittent reinforcement. The soul experiences it as emotional madness. And suddenly the empath is no longer living, only waiting, watching, analyzing tones, pauses, messages, energy shifts. The relationship becomes a labyrinth where hope keeps replacing clarity. There comes a moment when the empath begins disappearing. Not physically, energetically, passions fade, creativity weakens. The nervous system lives in survival mode. Even joy starts feeling dangerous because peace never lasts long enough. And the most painful part? The manipulator may not even fully understand what they are doing. Unhealed people unconsciously recreate chaos inside others. Pain spreads itself when left in darkness. Jung believed that unconscious people inevitably make others carry their shadow. The empath becomes the emotional container for wounds that were never theirs to hold. Healing begins with one terrifying realization: not everyone who suffers is safe to love closely. This truth breaks the empath's heart at first, because compassion naturally wants to rescue pain. But wisdom begins where self-abandonment ends. The soul was never created to be consumed by another person's emptiness. Love should expand life, not shrink it into anxiety. And strangely, the moment the empath stops trying to save everyone, something sacred returns. Energy, intuition, inner silence. The nervous system finally remembers what safety feels like. The empath eventually understands something that changes everything forever. Manipulation survives only where self-worth is fragile. The moment inner value awakens, toxic dynamics lose their hypnotic power. The need to prove love disappears. The attraction toward emotional chaos weakens. And for the first time, the empath no longer confuses intensity with destiny. Because real love does not drain the soul to test devotion. It does not require emotional self-sacrifice to survive. Real love feels calm enough for the spirit to breathe. And perhaps that is the deepest mystery of all. The empath was never meant to save broken souls by bleeding endlessly for them. The empath was meant to finally stop abandoning themselves. There is a hidden addiction many empaths carry without realizing it. The addiction to being needed. Not wanted, needed, because being needed creates importance. It gives the wounded heart a role, a purpose, a reason to stay. Manipulators sense this invisible hunger almost instantly. They speak the language of emotional dependency fluently. Suddenly, the empath feels chosen, irreplaceable, deeply significant. But true love does not survive by making someone responsible for another person's survival. That is emotional captivity disguised as intimacy. The manipulator often studies the empath more carefully than the empath studies themselves. Every fear is quietly memorized. Fear of abandonment, fear of conflict, fear of rejection, fear of being too much. And later, these fears become strings. Invisible emotional strings. One cold silence can create panic. One distant message can awaken childhood wounds. One moment of withdrawal becomes enough to make the empath overgive again. This is why manipulation feels so powerful. It reaches beneath logic and touches ancient emotional scars buried long ago. Some empaths stay not because they are blind, but because they remember the beautiful version of the person too vividly. The tenderness, the vulnerability, the late-night confessions, the moments that felt spiritually real. And so the empath keeps waiting for that version to return permanently. But manipulation survives through contrast. Pain followed by affection creates emotional bonding stronger than consistency ever could. The soul becomes trapped between memory and hope, loving who someone could be while slowly dying beside who they actually are. There is a moment when the empath begins shrinking emotionally to avoid triggering the other person, speaking softer, asking for less, needing less, feeling guilty for having emotions at all. This is not harmony. This is survival disguised as peacekeeping. Jung believed that whatever is rejected within eventually turns against the self. And every swallowed emotion becomes internal poison. The empath smiles outside while silently collapsing inside. Not because the soul is weak, because it has been carrying too much for too long. Manipulators often create emotional fog. Nothing is ever fully clear. Promises without stability. Affection without security. Apologies without change. The empath keeps trying harder because confusion creates obsession. The mind endlessly searches for answers, closure, certainty. But emotional chaos was never an accident. A confused person is easier to control. A spiritually exhausted person is easier to keep. And slowly the empath forgets that healthy love should feel grounding, not psychologically disorienting. One of the deepest wounds manipulators exploit is the empath's relationship with guilt. Sensitive souls often feel guilty for protecting themselves, guilty for saying no, guilty for leaving, guilty for choosing peace over emotional obligation. So they stay longer than their spirit can survive. And somewhere inside, the inner child still whispers, "If I love deeply enough, maybe I will finally be safe." But safety cannot be earned through self-erasure. No amount of sacrifice transforms emotional manipulation into love. The frightening truth is that some people are attracted not to the empath's soul, but to their tolerance. Tolerance for disrespect, tolerance for inconsistency, tolerance for emotional labor. The empath becomes emotionally available in ways that slowly destroy them, giving energy, reassurance, understanding, forgiveness while receiving uncertainty in return. And yet the heart still hesitates to leave because attachment can mimic destiny when trauma is involved. Not every intense connection is sacred. Some are simply familiar wounds recognizing each other in the dark. Eventually, the body begins rebelling against the relationship. Exhaustion appears without reason. Anxiety grows in silence. Sleep becomes restless. The nervous system never fully relaxes. The empath may call it stress, but the body is often more honest than the mind. The soul knows when love is becoming emotional imprisonment. It knows long before the conscious mind accepts it. This is why intuition feels heavy around manipulators. The spirit recognizes danger before logic finds proof. The hardest thing for the empath to accept is this: understanding someone does not obligate staying with them. Yes, their pain may be real. Yes, their wounds may explain their behavior. But explanations are not excuses for emotional destruction. Too many empaths confuse compassion with endless access. They believe love means remaining available no matter the cost. But even Jung warned against drowning inside another person's unconscious chaos. The soul can hold empathy without sacrificing itself on the altar of another person's healing. And one day, something shifts quietly inside the empath. Not anger, not revenge, awareness. The spell begins breaking. The over-explaining stops. The chasing weakens. The nervous system slowly unclenches. And for the first time, the empath notices how peaceful life feels without constantly managing someone else's emotional instability. That is the moment true healing begins. Not when the manipulator changes, but when the empath finally remembers their own worth was never supposed to depend on how much pain they could endure for love. Sometimes the empath mistakes emotional intensity for soul connection. The relationship feels magnetic, overwhelming, impossible to forget. Thoughts circle endlessly around the person like moths around fire. And because the emotions are so deep, the empath assumes the connection must be meaningful. But chaos can feel spiritual when the nervous system was raised inside unpredictability. The heart confuses emotional survival with passion. And the manipulator becomes addictive precisely because they alternate between closeness and absence. The soul keeps chasing the return of warmth like a lost traveler searching for light in the dark. There are relationships where the empath slowly becomes invisible. Not because nobody sees them, because nobody asks who they are beneath their usefulness. The manipulator speaks endlessly about their own pain, dreams, fears, crises, and the empath listens with sacred patience. But eventually something disturbing happens. The empath's inner world begins disappearing from the relationship entirely. Their role becomes emotional caretaker, a healer without rest, a lighthouse expected to shine no matter how violent the storm becomes. And somewhere deep inside, loneliness grows while lying beside another person. Manipulation often hides inside small moments. Tiny cuts repeated over time, the interrupted sentence, the subtle mockery disguised as humor, the guilt for expressing hurt, the affection given only after emotional obedience. Nothing dramatic enough to explain easily, yet enough to make the soul feel unsafe. This is why empaths doubt themselves for so long. The wounds are psychological whispers, not visible bruises. But the spirit notices patterns long before the conscious mind dares to name them. The empath often keeps loving long after the relationship has already become destructive. Not because the signs are invisible, because hope becomes stronger than reality. Hope that the tenderness will return. Hope that understanding will heal the other person. Hope that loyalty will eventually be rewarded with emotional safety. But manipulators often mistake unconditional love for unconditional access. And the empath slowly learns one of life's most painful truths. Love alone cannot heal someone who benefits from your emotional self-destruction. Carl Jung believed people meet themselves through others. And sometimes the manipulator arrives not to destroy the empath, but to reveal abandoned wounds hidden inside the soul. The fear of being alone, the terror of rejection, the belief that love must be earned through suffering. The relationship becomes a mirror. Painful, merciless, necessary, because until the empath faces the unconscious hunger to be chosen at any cost, manipulation will continue wearing different faces while telling the same story. There is something deeply tragic about emotionally sensitive people. They can sense pain even inside those who hurt them. So while being manipulated, the empath still worries about the manipulator's childhood, trauma, loneliness, fears. Compassion keeps interrupting clarity. And this creates inner warfare. Intuition says, leave. Compassion whispers, stay a little longer. The empath becomes divided against themselves. That is why manipulation drains sensitive souls so completely, not only emotionally, but spiritually. At some point, the empath begins noticing how rarely they feel calm around the person they love. Always analyzing, always anticipating mood changes, always preparing emotionally for distance, disappointment, withdrawal. Love becomes vigilance, and the nervous system, never allowed to rest, slowly forgets what peace feels like. Even moments of affection carry tension underneath them, because instability has already taught the body not to trust happiness for too long. This is not love nourishing the soul. This is attachment surviving inside emotional uncertainty. The manipulator often fears one thing more than losing the empath awakening, because awareness changes everything. The empath stops over-explaining, stops begging for clarity, stops accepting emotional crumbs as proof of love. And suddenly the dynamic loses power. Manipulation survives best when the empath remains disconnected from their own anger. Because anger, when healthy, protects the soul. It says, this hurts me. This crosses a boundary. This is not acceptable. But many empaths were taught to fear their own fire. There comes a strange grief after awakening. Not only grief for the relationship, but grief for the version of yourself that tolerated so much pain trying to be loved. The empath looks backward and barely recognizes the person who abandoned their intuition repeatedly for emotional survival. Yet healing is born exactly there. In the moment self-blame transforms into understanding. The soul finally sees that manipulation did not begin with weakness. It began with unmet emotional hunger searching for home inside another human being. And eventually, the empath stops romanticizing suffering. The attraction toward emotional chaos fades. Silence no longer feels threatening. Consistency stops feeling boring. For the first time, love is no longer confused with anxiety. And perhaps that is the true rebirth Jung spoke about, the moment a person stops searching outside themselves for permission to feel worthy. The empath finally understands. Real love does not require abandoning intuition, shrinking needs, or bleeding endlessly to prove devotion. Real love allows the soul to remain whole. There is a final illusion the empath must break before freedom becomes possible. The illusion that being chosen means being valued. Manipulators often choose empaths precisely because they give endlessly, forgive deeply, and abandon themselves quietly. The attention feels intoxicating at first, almost sacred, but attention is not the same as care. Some people admire the light only because they want to survive inside it, not because they want to protect it. And the empath slowly realizes how many times love was confused with emotional consumption. The soul reaches a point where it can no longer carry contradictions. Words that promise forever while actions create fear. Affection mixed with control. closeness poisoned by emotional instability. Something ancient awakens inside the empath then. A quiet inner voice that no longer begs for clarity because it already knows the truth. The body softens around safe people, tightens around danger, and suddenly intuition becomes louder than attachment. The empath no longer needs proof to honor discomfort. That is the moment the spell finally begins collapsing. Leaving manipulation rarely feels powerful in the beginning. Feels empty. The empath grieves not only the person, but the fantasy, the imagined future, the version of love that never truly existed outside hope. There are nights when loneliness whispers, maybe it was not that bad, but the nervous system remembers. The exhaustion remembers. The tears cried in silence remember. Healing is strange because peace can initially feel unfamiliar after living inside emotional chaos for so long. Stillness feels almost suspicious. Yet slowly, the soul relearns safety. And then one day, something beautiful happens. The empath stops trying to earn love. No more shrinking. No more overgiving. No more apologizing for emotional needs. The heart becomes calmer, more discerning, more protective of its energy. And for the first time, compassion flows inward too, not only toward wounded people who take without limit. Jung believed enlightenment comes not by imagining figures of light, but by becoming conscious of the darkness. The empath finally sees the unconscious patterns that once chained the soul to manipulation. And awareness breaks the cycle that sacrifice never could. In the end, the deepest transformation was never about losing the manipulator. It was about finding the self abandoned in order to keep love alive. The empath was never weak for loving deeply. The tragedy was only forgetting that sensitivity without boundaries becomes self-destruction. And now the soul understands something it once feared to believe. Love should feel safe enough for truth, soft enough for rest, stable enough for the nervous system to breathe. Not every intense connection is destiny. Not every wounded soul is yours to save. Sometimes the greatest act of love an empath can learn is finally refusing to disappear inside someone else's darkness. If some part of the story felt painfully familiar, share it in the comments. Sometimes healing begins the moment the soul realizes it is no longer alone in its silence. And if these reflections speak to something deep inside you, subscribe to the channel. There are still many hidden truths about the empath's journey waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for watching.